Hi, this is Catherine. This is Taking Tea with Catherine. This is again Rose Lemonade from Taylor's of Harrogate. Yes, I've been drinking this a lot lately because I've just been in a very big lemonade mood and it's a very summery flavor. So I think that works for the fact that even though I am out of August now, it is still pretty summery. We're in the middle of a heat wave, which hopefully won't be that long of a heat wave because I am ready for autumn. But until then, iced tea it is. And also it works because I am talking about August. I'm talking about my reading in August, and what could be more summery than that? So I will enjoy this as much as I can, which is quite a lot. I don't really get tired of iced tea as the months go on. But anyway, I am talking about my reading of August 2023, and it was a bit of an improvement if you're just going to go by the numbers, because I know I've been a slow reader lately, and again, I say that like I'm apologizing. Yes, it means that I don't have as many books to talk about, but honestly, if I enjoy my reading for the most part, I don't think it's a problem. It was just that I was so slow that I was reading four or fewer a month, and now I've gotten up to five. So I'm a little proud of myself. And partially because when I read more books, I also get to read a bigger variety of books, and I like a varied reading month. But either way, even if I read three, I would be happy to talk about my month. So here is August. And let's see, we have here three fiction books, two nonfiction. Give me a moment to actually look at everything because I can't always tell. Three library books and two books that I've owned for a while. And yeah, and that's the stats for now. Um, where do I start? I'm not going to start in any particular order. I'm just going to go, actually, I'm going to go, I think, in size order, like the height of each book. That's what I'm going to do. So, I don't know, bumpy ride? Who knows? So, I'm going to start with a history book, well, a historical biography book that I've been meaning to read for a while. I read an article about it in the BBC History magazine, which is one of the few magazines I subscribe to now because I'm a history nerd, and I'm a British history nerd, so of course. And that is The Red Prince, John of Gaunt by Helen Carr. Wasn't really explained why they called him the Red Prince, because I don't even know if that's what he was called at the time or thereafter. The only thing I can see really is that John of Gaunt was the Duke of Lancaster, which I believe was the Red Rose of Lancaster when they got into the Wars of the Roses, and York was the White Rose. So, but I think they just did that. I think the author just chose that as a slight comparison, maybe not comparison, but just a relation with the Black Prince, which was John of Gaunt's brother. So I suppose that makes sense, but whatever. Um, he was it was interesting, this story. I've already known a bit about him. I've read books about the kings and queens of England, and he features in there because a lot, and the current monarch, Charles III, yeah, is descended from him, as well as many others. And because it wasn't just that his son Henry IV took over the kingship after he defeated basically Richard II, but also because his illegitimate children, who were legitimized, were the Beauforts. Beaufort, yeah. I don't know why I can't say that that name, and as we know, the mother of Henry Tudor was, well, as you might know, Margaret Beaufort. I'm trying not to assume that you who are watching know everything about history, so I will try to forget that I am, that I. Anyway, so he is I know I just read this book, but he is, I believe, the third born son of Edward III. And Edward III had a lot of kids, legitimate and illegitimate. He lost some of them to plague, which is a big feature in this book. It changed a lot, of course, when the plague came to England and, of course, Europe. It really did a number on the population, which changed society altogether. So John of Gaunt was in the midst of that. He was also in the middle of the 100 Years' War between England and France, wherein England was laying a claim to France, the throne of France, and also just to parts of France, and France wasn't agreeing, so there was fights back and forth, and it was an interesting time. I don't know if I admire per se any of these people, but they were pretty amazing as far as fighting and everything. They would go to these battles and well, the chivalry and all that. It's not really my cup of tea, but it is interesting because it's a comparison between certain kings and certain other ones and what the values were, what was important about them at the time, if that makes sense. I say that because he was very supportive of his father when he was king and his eldest brother, who was to be the future king, but his eldest brother predeceased the king. So his younger son, I should say, because he had another son who died also, became Richard II. And John of Gaunt was supportive of his nephew and loyal. He was very loyal to his family, and they were supportive of him also trying to get the throne of Castile in Spain, which didn't quite work out, but what are you going to do? I don't know. The people of Spain may have had other opinions as to whether they wanted him or not, but he thought he had a right to it through marriage, his second marriage, possibly too. A lot of what John of Gaunt did actually get was through marriage. He got the dukedom of Lancaster through his first wife. So, but he was very supportive. He wasn't someone who was trying to take over the kingship of England anyway for himself. And his sister-in-law, the mother of Richard II, they were friendly. There were no massive rivalries between these siblings, which is why it is kind of sad that the next generation had such fallings out. And Richard II did end up having at least one, maybe two of his uncles executed, and executed his cousin, who later became Henry IV because he returned from exile and after his father John of Gaunt died. Anyway, so it's really hard to talk about this book without assuming that you know something about the time. So I will suffice it to say that it was a good book. In the beginning, it wasn't so much about John of Gaunt as it was about the time period, which happens often with historical biographies. But if you were really thinking it was going to be purely about him, not so much, although he was definitely covered a little bit later in life. During the Peasants' Rebellion, which was a big deal in 1381, it affected him greatly because while he was away, thankfully he was away, I guess, his palace, the Savoy Palace, was destroyed. And I always was curious about what that place must have looked like. Now it's the location of the Savoy Hotel in London, which I've never actually been inside of either. But that is a digression. But yeah, like what I say was, it was good, but there were moments I said, they never mention when his son was born. Maybe they don't even have, I can't remember if they even have his birthday or not, because in those days they didn't always mark it. But how do you not mention when his wife gave birth to Henry IV, the future Henry IV? How is that not even mentioned? So those little lacks of detail sometimes jarred at me. Is that the word? Was jarring. I can't think of words anymore. But I did actually enjoy this book. It didn't drag. It wasn't a very long book. So if you just wanted to learn a little bit about the life of this slightly forgotten prince, duke, whatever you want to call him, this is a good one. And it does talk about Geoffrey Chaucer, that time period. Although I have to say, if I was going to choose between entertainment value and learning a little something, I would also say Anya Seton, I think that's how you say her name's book, Catherine, about his the woman that his mistress, I guess, who I believe he married later on in life, and then of course his children through her were legitimized. Yes, this is Catherine, who loves the English language. To the Beauforts. That story, of course, is dramatic, fiction, but in a way, for, like I said, more interesting to say the least. But I would also recommend this book, but I wouldn't say it's the best historical biography I ever read. Somewhere in good, not great. Like I could do better, right? But anyway, so next in size, because I'm just going to do that today, is I finally got to this book. I'd taken it out in, I think in March. I was planning to read it for middle grade March. Excuse me. Okay, for middle grade March, and I think I mostly read mysteries in March and didn't get to this. And I had it out from the library for a billion years, and I finally read it. And I'm so pleased with myself because it ended up being a fun read. This is the Treehouse Library, which is, I believe, the fourth out of the fifth in the series. The fifth isn't out yet. I think it's coming out soon in England, but I don't know when it's coming out in America. But I could wait. I obviously waited long enough to read this one. So this is by Anna James. This is the Pages and Co. Book Wanderers, they call it, the Treehouse Library. I call it Jasper Ford Jr., even though they're kind of different in terms of the story itself, but and especially because it's more about children's books. But I say that because it's about people who can read themselves into a book. So you read a book and then you are in it. You're in the story. You can see the people there. You can interact with them. You can eat the food there. That's pretty amazing. And although the book goes a lot into like the power of imagination, which is in itself empowering as a reader, because if you read that, you can get the lesson of all of us readers with our imaginations are book wanderers. So in a sense that's encouraging. But this is mainly the story in this particular book of Milo, who lives on a train. It's got a long name, but they call it for short the Quip, which runs on imagination. They call it book magic, but it's basically imagination. And previously, the series was mostly about Matilda Pages, or Tilly, and her grandparents own a bookshop in London, and she is she has certain abilities within the books that other people don't have for reasons that I don't want to give away because it would be a spoiler of the series. But there are certain people who are using the ability to book wander for bad purposes. And there is one particular bad dude called the Alchemist, and he has poisoned the uncle of the Quip, of Milo, who has been running this train for a long time. So Milo is with Tilly and her family back in London, while Milo and, now I forgot her name, Alessia, who is, I think that's her name, who is the daughter of the alchemist, but is on the side of the others. They're trying to assemble a cure for this poisoning, and they're going to someone who's called the botanist, whose name is actually Rosa, who lives in a treehouse library, hence the title. So in order to get these ingredients for this cure, this recipe, they have to go into different books. So they go into certain books like Robin Hood, and I'm forgetting the books they went into for a moment there. So yes, they went into the Secret Garden, and there's a bit of a warning in there about, you may encounter certain things that are in modern times not looked well upon, the views on people of different backgrounds. There's certain language used in the Secret Garden in a way that's good. Nowadays, you kind of have to say things like that, content warning. So I guess it was good for that to be included. And of course, the Jabberwocky. So I used to have that poem memorized, but no more. So it was a lot of fun, the book. I remember I had read some reviews on Goodreads that said, oh, it ends with a cliffhanger. But it doesn't end in a cliffhanger to the point that it hurts. I don't want to tell you how, but it feels like, okay, so I'm gonna look forward to the next book. That's the point of a series. I don't like painful cliffhangers, but I also don't mind looking forward to the next book. Balance it out a little bit. But it was a fun, adventurous story, not overly adventurous, like not constantly doing battles and jumping over things. It was fun. I would say if you like a little bit of fantasy and books about books, mostly children's books, then this is a book that you might enjoy. Oh yeah, also The Owl and the Pussycat by Lear. That was another one, which I didn't expect to enjoy, but I did. Okay, so next in line is another fiction book, and this was a carryover from Jane Austen's July, and that is Just Jane by Nancy Mosher. Nancy Mosher, it looks like she's kind of a Christian fiction writer, so if someone's really not into that, then just FYI. I don't think it actually affected the story in a good or bad way. But it makes sense because there's certain references to, God and prayer and scripture, which would make sense for someone who is the daughter of a clergyman, right? I mean, so that's not a big stretch. But this is a first-person account of Jane Austen's life. So when she is young, and not too young, but youngish, and starting her writing, mostly about her writing and how her life and her writing are intertwined. and also the times when she isn't writing what's going on, and the different people she meets, and her relationship with her sister, with her the different people she meets in her life that maybe are possible marriage mates. But if you know anything about Jane Austen's life, she didn't actually get married. And also, like, there were things about how things in her life affected her writing or inspired her writing, but it wasn't over the top. You might say, okay, this is. I never thought that Tom Lefroy totally was an inspiration for Mr. Darcy at all, but I could see how some people might extract that. It was, if you haven't ever read anything about Jane Austen's life, you might learn a little bit about her here. If you have, it's a repeat, but it was pretty entertaining. I thought it was a good fictional autobiography, as it were. um, First person. What do they call it when it's real time? Or not real time, that's not the right word, but it's present tense, that's right. Present tense. So I would say, if you're looking for a book, not just for Jane Austen in July, but definitely if you get into the next time where you want another fiction book about Jane Austen's life, this is a good one. It runs pretty well. There were certain moments that were a little corny, like when she just was thinking about something and then it was at the exact moment where someone she knew had died, and I was like, yeah, coincidence and all that stuff. But it's easily overcome. It's not this most amazing book, but it's a good one. Okay, so next is The Lost King: The Search for Richard III by Philippa Langley and Michael Jones. Here is the picture. This is, from the film, picture from the film. The film is, I would say, loosely based on what happened in this book. There's a lot about Philippa Langley's life that isn't covered in this book, that is more covered in the film. But I saw the movie The Lost King in March, and since then I've always been interested in the whole Richard III situation, but since then I've been wanting to read again more books about it and different points of view. And I thought this was more balanced than I thought it was going to be, because I thought this would be very rabidly like, Richard III is an innocent saint and we must, revere him or something. And it wasn't. There was an appendix from 2 points of view, from both of the writers' points of view, for and against the thought of Richard III being guilty of murdering the princes of the Tower, not specifically himself, but being responsible, which were his nephews, in case you haven't read this part of history that much. When Richard III was just Richard, Duke of Gloucester, much like John of Gaunt, an uncle to a future king, a brother who dies, also named Edward, who dies young. But this situation was, I think, far worse because, well, in some ways far worse for the Duke, because he did not particularly get along with his in-laws, his brother's wife and family. I don't think there was like rabid hate for each other, but they were not on the same side really. And immediately, maybe that wasn't very, very well known at the time, but when Edward IV died, and he was like just about 40, I think, which is quite young, so I don't think anyone was really prepared for it. Suddenly he had a young teenage son, maybe 13ish, and a slightly younger son, and that could have proved very difficult for someone like Richard, who, if your nephew is the king, but he's not really close to you, maybe he will not favor you very much, and maybe he'll take on the opinions of your in-laws and turn against you. There were precedents for that. I'm not taking his side on whether he did it or not, but anyway, this story obviously does get into a little bit of how Richard took on. First, he was the protector of the realm, but then he quickly found evidence, whether it was real or not, that his nephews were illegitimate because of a previous marriage of the previous king, and declared himself the king, and the boys were lodged in the Tower of London. I know I've said this story before, but I usually have to repeat myself because I don't know how many times, if you're going to go back and watch old videos. But they were lodged in the Tower of London, which actually happened to a lot of people as they became the next monarch. They stayed first in the Tower before they went to their coronation. So this was not far off. It wasn't like the Tudor times when the Tower became like a very doom laden fortress, but they were there, and now they were not, they were illegitimate, and they were in the Tower, and then within months they weren't heard from ever again. So this reflected badly on the now Richard III, because the thought was that he probably murdered his nephews, and that is not great for any relative of any age, but especially young boys of a young age. So yes, that did make him look bad. And then eventually, a couple of years later, when Henry Tudor uh, challenged him in the Battle of Bosworth, not everyone thought that it was a bad thing that Henry Tudor won and became the next king. They said this was a judgment on Richard III. Whatever. The point is that when Richard III was defeated at the Battle of Bosworth, his body was apparently humiliated a little bit, and then buried quite unceremoniously, and then lost. And Philippa Langley was one of the people. She wasn't the only one, but she was someone who was very, very interested in finding his body, and then, or his remains, I should say, and then to have him buried in the way he would have liked to have been buried, which actually is what happened in 2012. They found his remains in a car park. This is now pretty well known, and he has been since reinterred. Most of this story, though, was not just an account of the finding of the body, because it is a longer account than what you'll see in the film. The film seems like it happened within a year. The events of the research and everything and finding it took much longer than that. But that's okay. It's movies, you have to adapt, right? But and it says reads like an up all night thriller. I wouldn't quite say that, but because there's a lot of details. But the important part of this story, which makes it more than just a biography of Richard III and finding of his remains, the important part of this book, I thought, was the argument about how, and it was a little repetitive, but the argument was that Richard III, whenever he was either in charge of or supporting the disinterment or reburial of certain remains, whether it was of his own relatives who had been killed ignominiously or his enemies, he always made sure that they received a proper burial. And so the argument here was, if he was doing this, if he was so if he had shown himself so respectful of other people's burials and their wishes in that respect, then we should at least do the same for him. Whether he was guilty, not guilty, whether he was a usurper or not, at least he should. And he was legitimately a king, though. He was, he had a coronation and everything. He should at least get that. You could always argue there's a lot of, people's bodies who have been lost forever, whether they were royal or peasants or whatever. So what does it matter? But that was the point. The point was that when he had it in his power, he did a good turn, So that was the argument to having him buried in a proper place, and as a Catholic, actually, because he was technically a Catholic. So I thought it was a good story and a good argument. And it was definitely pro Richard, and I tend to lean that way myself, even if I know that he probably was responsible for certain things, just because it's so interesting to read those arguments for him. But I thought it was a good book. If you're interested in that time period, it is definitely one you could get a hold of. Okay, we're spending a lot of time, but that's good, because I was very much enjoying my reading this month. Next, last and probably least, and can't believe I'm saying this about a book by Anthony Trollope, but I read The Fixed Period by Anthony Trollope, and I knew already I had this book. I bought it in, I don't think it was last year, maybe the year before, in a Housing Works, I believe, which is a used bookshop in downtown-ish Manhattan near Soho. And they, pretty good prices for classics and other books. And I knew from the beginning, from reading the back of the story, that it was slightly sci-fi. And I was like, I did not realize that Anthony Trollope wrote sci-fi, so this should be interesting. And it was interesting, but it was disappointing, because not just because the technology spoken of in this book is obviously not what existed at the time that he was writing about, I mean, it was a Victorian perspective. So it wasn't just that. It was even the rights of property, and I believe even women's rights and that sort of thing it seemed to be about the same in the future. It takes place I believe it was the 1980s, and it was written around the 1880s. And the premise is that there is a group of people that moved to, I think, not far from New Zealand, and or it wasn't even part of New Zealand. I can't remember. It was Oceania, whatever it was, and they became an independent land, governed by a president, and they had their own set of rules, and but they had originally come from England, Britain, and they become quite prosperous actually. But one of the founding parts of the law, parts of the regulations and everything, was determining this fixed period, which was that at the point of life when you hit 67, you go to a place called the college, where you have about a year and you just chill for about a year, and then you are euthanized. So no one has to face the indignity of old age. That's the argument. And the president is a man named, I believe his first name is John Neverbend, which is a great Trollope name, Neverbend, because he is quite stubborn and he really wants to stick to this. But the story begins at the point wherein the first person to actually reach that age where they're going to be put into this college and then, face their doom, is a man who had seemed to be in agreement all these years, but now that he had reached that age and he was in perfectly good health and prosperity, and he had a daughter of marriageable age, and everything seems to be going well for him, now he's rethinking things. And now we're seeing what's going to happen when people are facing the reality of their death, when there's no reason really to die. And it is a little creepy to think about. Imagine if you reach a certain age and that's it for you. I have a little while before I turn 67 myself, but I have to say it's not as far off as it used to be, and that would be a really weird prospect if I were in good health, especially. But so it is an interesting argument. In that way, it's a good book as far as discussion wise. But in execution, like I said, first of all, it was a little clanky with all the somewhat imagined technology that just like steam powered tricycles, and there's a whole chapter about a cricket match, and the things that they use, the implements, the sports equipment, are all powered by different modern technology, and that's about it. There's not really that much of a future that sounds at all like our future, or now our past. And I know I know you can't always come up with everything, but it was hard to read. And it wasn't just that premise was kind of creepy, but also that the way it was resolved was a little, I felt like, anticlimactic. And I didn't hate it, but I really didn't like it. Like, there were moments that were interesting and almost funny. And when, Trollope has this way of having characters that just get stuck on an idea. And this man's idea is that he is like Galileo and Columbus, that no one ever really quite understood those people or agreed with them, but look how wonderful they are now. Nowadays, we don't look at Columbus really in that way. But I would say that I would not recommend this book if it's your first Trollope. Please do not read The Fixed Period unless you just want to read a book that is considered science fiction and you're curious about it. It's not the worst book I ever read, but it is by no means the best Trollope. And I'm looking forward to my next Trollope, which I believe will be a lot better. Almost any Trollope would be better than this one. And creepily enough, Anthony Trollope died at 67. Yeah, isn't that weird? But anyway, so those were the books I read in the month of August. I really enjoyed them for the most part, even if they were, some misses. So let me know what you think of them. Let me know if you've read any of these books, if you agree or disagree, if you read anything in particular that you liked in August, and if you are looking forward to the autumn, because I certainly am, and it's not really here for us yet, at least not here. So that's all for now. This is Catherine at Taking Tea with Catherine. Have a lovely tea and book-filled day or month.